The air in a home is supposed to be a sanctuary. It's the invisible medium of our private lives, carrying the scent of coffee in the morning, the warmth of a shared laugh, the quiet stillness of a late night. We never think about the air until it changes, until it becomes heavy, until it carries something else. This is a story about that change. It's a story told in fragments, in the memories of people who lived in ordinary places, apartments with thin walls, suburban houses with well-tended lawns, country estates draped in wisteria and shadow. They all shared a singular, creeping realization, one that arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper against the ear in the dead of night. The spaces we inhabit are never truly empty, and some of the presences that move through them are not content to simply share the space. They are patient, they are intelligent, and they have been watching us all along. Our first story begins not in a crumbling Victorian manor, but in a sleek, modern high-rise in a city that prided itself on its future-facing skyline. The apartment was on the 42nd floor, a glass and steel box in the sky that belonged to a man named Elias. He was a sound engineer, a man whose entire livelihood depended on the precise capture and manipulation of auditory detail. For Elias, silence wasn't an absence. It was a canvas. His apartment was his temple of quiet. He'd had the place specially fitted with acoustic panels disguised as minimalist art. The windows were triple glazed to mute the city's perpetual hum, and the floors were laid with thick, sound-dampening cork beneath engineered oak. It was, by any technical measure, one of the quietest residential spaces in the metropolis. Elias moved in during the autumn, when the city's energy was a low, constant thrum below him. The first few weeks were bliss. He would sit in his leather armchair, a glass of something amber in his hand, and simply exist in the profound quiet. He could hear his own heartbeat if he concentrated. He could hear the soft whisper of air from the HVAC vents. It was perfect. The first anomaly was so subtle that, for a man of his training, it was almost embarrassing to acknowledge. It was a sound, but not one he could classify. He was in his home studio late one night, editing a track for a documentary about Arctic explorers. The raw audio was filled with the vast, empty silence of ice fields. He had his high-fidelity headphones on, isolating himself from the apartment's environment. But between tracks, in that sliver of digital silence, he heard it. A sound that was not in the recording. It was a sound from his apartment, a single, soft footfall. Not from the hallway outside, which was carpeted, but from the polished oak of his living room floor. It was a distinct tap, like a single, deliberate step. He pulled the headphones down around his neck, his heart performing a small, involuntary lurch. He sat motionless, listening. The apartment was silent. He looked towards the living room, visible through the open door of his studio. The city lights cast a cool, bluish grid across the floor, illuminating the space in sharp, geometric angles. There was nothing there. He told himself it was the building settling. A skyscraper was a living thing, he reasoned, swaying imperceptibly, its materials expanding and contracting. The sound was a microstress fracture in the concrete core, manifesting as a pop, a perfectly logical explanation. He put his headphones back on and finished his work, but a part of his mind, the part that cataloged frequencies and timbres, had filed that sound away as anomalous. It had been too rhythmic, too deliberate. Over the next 2 weeks, the sounds became more frequent and more personal. He'd be in the kitchen, the granite countertop cold under his hands, and he'd hear a faint creak from the bedroom, as if someone had shifted their weight on the edge of his bed. He'd be in the shower, the water pressure a consistent roar, and he'd feel a sudden, localized drop in temperature outside the frosted glass door, a cold draft that slithered in and raised goosebumps on his wet skin. The first time it happened, he dismissed it as a faulty seal in the ventilation system. The second time, he checked the thermostat. The third time, he stood in the steam, listening, his eyes fixed on the distorted silhouette of the bathroom door, waiting for it to move. It never did. The tipping point came on a Thursday night. Elias was lying in bed, not quite asleep, in that hypnagogic state where the mind drifts between the conscious and the unconscious. The room was dark, the only light a pale sliver from the blackout curtains where they didn't quite meet. He was facing the wall, his back to the expanse of the bedroom. And then he felt it. A presence. Not a sound, not a sight, but a deep, primal awareness that he was no longer alone. It was a shift in the very gravity of the room. The air pressure seemed to change, making his ears feel clogged. The fine hairs on the back of his neck rose. He could feel something looking at him, not from the doorway but from the foot of his bed. A focused, patient observation. His instinct was to roll over, to confront the empty space and dispel the illusion with the clarity of his own vision. But a deeper instinct, one he didn't know he possessed, held him frozen. To turn would be to acknowledge it, to see it. And his mind, screaming with denial, told him that as long as he didn't see it, it couldn't be real. He lay there, his breathing shallow and controlled, his muscles rigid for what felt like an eternity. And then he heard it. A whisper. Not a voice with words, but a sound like a breath being drawn in, held, and then released in a soft, sibilant sigh right at the edge of his pillow. The exhale was warm. It moved the fine hairs around his ear. That was when the paralysis broke. With a gasp that was half scream, he lunged for the bedside lamp, his hand slapping against the switch. Light flooded the room, harsh and yellow. He was alone. The duvet was rumpled, his pillow was dented, but the space beside him and at the foot of the bed was empty. He sat there, his back against the headboard, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the room until the first gray light of dawn began to seep past the curtains. He didn't sleep, he couldn't. His mind replayed the whisper, the warmth of that exhaled breath, his own breath. But it hadn't been his. His mouth had been closed, his jaw clenched in fear. He tried to rationalize it as a hypnagogic hallucination, a common phenomenon where the brain projects sensory experiences during the transition to sleep. It was a logical, scientific explanation, and he clung to it. But the sounds didn't stop. They escalated. He'd find his studio equipment powered on in the morning, even though he knew he'd shut it down. The levels on his mixing board would be altered, faders pushed to unnatural positions, creating a configuration that produced no sound he could comprehend, just a low, subaudible hum that he could feel in his teeth. He started seeing shadows in his peripheral vision. Dark, human-shaped forms that would dart from the living room to the hallway the moment he turned his head. He'd whip around, and there would be nothing but the clean, modernist lines of his own home. He stopped inviting people over. He stopped going out. His world shrank to the 42nd floor, a gilded cage where he was the specimen under observation. The presence, whatever it was, seemed to feed on his fear. The cold spots became more pronounced, following him from room to room. The whispers, once a single breathy sigh, began to take on a shape. He couldn't discern words, but he could discern intent. It was questioning. It was learning. It was studying his reactions. One night, in a fit of desperate defiance, he set up his most sensitive recording equipment in the living room. He placed a high-gain omnidirectional microphone in the center of the room, calibrated to capture the slightest acoustic anomaly. He connected it to his laptop, which was set to record continuously. Then he went to his bedroom, closed the door, and tried to sleep. He woke to the sound of his laptop crashing to the floor. He rushed out to find the microphone stand toppled, the cable ripped from the interface. On his laptop screen, the recording software was still running, but the waveform was flat. It showed nothing, except for one file, a new one he hadn't created, sitting in the project folder. Its title was a string of random characters. His hands trembling, he double-clicked it. What played back was a recording of his own apartment. He recognized the subtle ambient hum of the refrigerator, the distant sigh of the HVAC. For the first hour, it was just that. Then, at the 57-minute mark, the ambient noise dipped. It wasn't a sound being added. It was as if the life, the very air, was being sucked out of the room. The silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of his sanctuary. It was a dead silence, a void. And then over the speakers came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the sound of a zipper being slowly, deliberately undone. He hadn't owned a garment with a zipper in years. The sound was followed by a soft, fabric-like rustle, and then the whisper again. But this time it was captured, undeniable, a spectral frequency etched into the digital file. And just before the recording ended, he heard his own voice, coming from the microphone that was in the living room while he had been in the bedroom, whispering back. He was saying words he had never spoken. The voice was his, but the cadence was alien. It was holding a conversation with itself. Elias left that apartment the next morning. He never went back. He sold it to a developer who saw only the square footage and the view, and he moved to a single-story house in a suburb an hour away, a place with no upstairs, no downstairs, just a single level on solid ground. But the story of that high-rise apartment, with its perfect silence and its uninvited occupant, is not an isolated incident. It is merely the first thread in a tapestry of terror that stretches across the city and beyond, a pattern of unseen presences that have found their way into the most private of spaces. Because a presence that learns to manipulate audio in a sound engineer's home is not a random phenomenon. It is a mind that is adapting. Our next story takes us to a very different kind of home, but one that shared a similar, subtle infection. This was a suburban house, the kind you'd see on a postcard of idealized family life. It was a two-story colonial revival on a quiet, tree-lined street in a town where the biggest scandal was usually a property line dispute over a hedge. The family who lived there, the Changs, had moved in 7 years prior. They had 2 children, a dog named Machi, and a mortgage that was the very definition of responsible adulthood. For the first 6 years, it was a home filled with the happy chaos of life. But in the 7th year, a change began, so slow and so subtle that at first, no one in the family spoke of it. They each absorbed the anomalies individually, like silent, private burdens. It started with the dog. Machi, a cheerful and somewhat simple-minded Shiba Inu, began to refuse to enter the basement. The basement was finished, a rec room with a pool table and a large-screen TV, a space the family used frequently. But one day, Miro, the father, was carrying a laundry basket down the stairs, and Machi, who usually bounded ahead, stopped at the top of the stairs. He planted his paws, his ears flattened against his head, and he let out a low, continuous growl, his eyes fixed on the darkness at the bottom of the stairs. Miro turned on all the lights, called the dog, but Machi wouldn't budge. He eventually had to carry the 40-pound dog down, and the entire time Machi trembled, his eyes never leaving a specific corner of the room where a large, empty bookshelf stood against the wall. Soon, Machi's aversion spread. He would no longer stay in the living room after sunset. He'd whine at the back door to be let out, and then he'd refuse to come back in, standing on the patio, his nose pointed towards the house, a posture of anxious vigilance. The family attributed it to age or a change in his senses. But then the children began to mention things. The youngest, a boy of 6 named Leo, started asking his mother, "Why does the lady in my closet whisper my name when I'm trying to sleep?" His mother, Alina, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the central air. She told Leo it was just the house settling, the wind, his imagination. But she checked the closet every night, and every night it was filled only with neatly hung clothes and boxes of toys. The older daughter, Maya, who was 12, became more withdrawn. She stopped having friends over. She stopped playing her music in her room, something that had once been a constant, joyful noise. One evening, Elena found her sitting on her bed in the dark, staring at her own reflection in the dark screen of her computer monitor. "Maya, what's wrong?" Elena asked, flipping the light switch. Maya flinched, blinking in the sudden brightness. "Nothing," she said, a little too quickly. But as Elena turned to leave, Maya's voice stopped her. "Mom, do you ever feel like there's someone in the house who isn't us?" Elena turned back. Her daughter's face was pale, her eyes wide. "What do you mean?" Elena asked, her voice carefully neutral. Maya looked towards her closed door. I hear things at night, not like the house sounds. It's like walking, but not in the hallway. It's like someone walking inside the walls. And sometimes I smell perfume. An old kind, like flowers and powder. It comes from the heating vent. Alina hadn't told anyone about the perfume. She had started smelling it weeks ago. A cloying, floral scent that would appear suddenly in the kitchen, near the back door, and then vanish as quickly as it came. She had dismissed it as a phantom scent, a trick of her olfactory memory. But hearing her daughter describe the same thing made it undeniably real. That night, after the children were in bed, she told Miro. They sat at the kitchen island, the glow of the under-cabinet lights creating a small island of warmth in the dark house. Miro, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical but not dismissive. He had noticed things too. The tools in his garage would be rearranged, not just misplaced, but meticulously organized in a way he didn't recognize. He'd find a tape measure on a shelf where he kept his wrenches, and a wrench in the drawer where he kept his screwdrivers. It was as if someone with a different system of logic was using his space. They decided to do a thorough check of the house. The attic, the crawlspace, the basement. They found nothing. No signs of intrusion, no rodents, no structural issues. But when they were in the basement, standing by that large, empty bookshelf that Machi always stared at, they both felt it. A sudden, intense cold that emanated from the wall behind the shelf. It wasn't a draft. It was a localized, palpable pocket of cold air that seemed to have mass, to have weight. Miro put his hand against the drywall. It was ice cold. He ran his hand along the wall, and the cold was confined to a space about 4 feet wide and 6 feet high, the shape of a door. A door that didn't exist. Alina, standing beside him, watched his hand move. And then she saw it. Not a shadow, but an absence of light. A shape darker than the surrounding darkness. A silhouette of a person standing on the other side of the basement near the stairs. It was tall, with the vague outline of shoulders and a head. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there watching them. She grabbed Miro's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "There," she whispered, her voice a breath. Miro turned. The silhouette was gone, but the cold remained, pressing against them from the wall of the non-existent door. The escalation after that was rapid. It was as if their acknowledgement of it, their shared experience, had given it permission to become bolder. Objects began to move in plain sight. Keys would slide off the kitchen counter, not falling, but sliding as if pushed by an invisible hand, coming to rest on the floor. Cabinets would open by themselves, slowly, one after another, creating a domino effect of creaking hinges down the hallway. One night, Miro was watching television alone in the living room. The house was silent. He was half dozing when he heard a distinct 3-part knock on the front door. Knock, knock, knock. He got up, looked through the peephole. The porch was empty. He opened the door. No one was there. He was about to close it when he noticed the potted plant by the door. It had been moved. It was now placed directly in the center of the doormat, facing the house, as if it had been positioned there to watch. The most terrifying incident, however, involved Leo. In the middle of the night, Alina was jolted awake by a sense of wrongness. She lay still, listening. The house was quiet, but her maternal instinct, that primal alarm, was shrieking. She got up and went to Leo's room. His door was open. She always closed it. She peered inside. Leo was sitting up in bed, but he wasn't asleep. He was staring at his closet door. His face was blank, but tears were streaming silently down his cheeks. "Leo," she whispered, rushing to him. He didn't respond. She grabbed his shoulders, turning him to face her. His eyes were vacant, unseeing. "Leo," she said louder, shaking him gently. He blinked and his eyes slowly focused on her face. He let out a shuddering breath and collapsed against her, sobbing. "She was showing me things," he whimpered into her shoulder. "She was showing me pictures in my head of when the house was new, and there was a girl. She said she's been waiting for us to see her." The Cheng family moved out within the week. They left most of their belongings behind, unable to bear the thought of packing them, of touching objects that might have been observed, rearranged, claimed by the unseen resident. The real estate agent later told them that the house had a history. It had been built on the site of an older home that had burned down in the 1950s. A family had lived there. A family with a daughter who had died in the fire, trapped in her room on the second floor. The room that was now Leo's. The house had been rebuilt, the land scraped clean and blessed with new foundations, but it seemed that some things are not so easily erased. The presence that had whispered Leo's name, that had shown him pictures from a past life, was not a random ghost. It was a memory with a will. It had been waiting, patient and lonely, for someone to acknowledge it. And in that acknowledgement, it had found a way to reach out, to touch the living, to show them that the boundaries between then and now, between here and there, are not as solid as we believe them to be. We've seen a presence in a modern high-rise that learned to mimic and manipulate sound, a skill it developed from observing a sound engineer. We've seen a presence in a suburban colonial that was tied to a specific tragedy, its intelligence focused on the family's children, seeking a connection it had lost decades ago. These are not the same entity. They are different manifestations, different flavors of the same unsettling truth. But as our stories unfold, a third story will begin to show us the threads that connect them, a pattern of behavior that suggests a singular, patient, and deeply intelligent force at work, using these locations and these families as pieces in a larger game. Our next location is a country estate, miles from the nearest neighbor, a place where the solitude is so profound that the presence of another, even an unseen one, becomes a deafening roar. The estate was called Blackwood Manor, a name that conjured Gothic novels and stormy nights, but in reality, it was a beautifully restored Georgian manor house in the rolling hills of the countryside. It was owned by a woman named Anya, an art conservator who had bought the property with an inheritance. For Anya, the house was a restoration project, a labor of love. She spent years painstakingly returning it to its former glory, stripping away modern additions, sourcing period-appropriate fixtures, filling its grand rooms with antique furniture and her own collection of art. It was her masterpiece, and for the first 2 years it was a peaceful haven. She would walk the long halls, her footsteps echoing on the wide oak planks, and feel a sense of deep, abiding satisfaction. She was the sole custodian of this beautiful piece of history. The first sign of trouble was not something she saw or heard, but something she felt. It was a feeling of being watched, but with a difference. In the high-rise, it had been a predatory observation. In the suburban home, it had been a lonely, searching one. Here, at Blackwood Manor, it was a feeling of being judged. She would be in her studio, a converted ballroom on the second floor, meticulously cleaning a 17th-century painting, and she would feel a presence behind her, a critical, assessing gaze. She'd turn, and there would be only the vast, empty room, the afternoon light filtering through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air. It began to manifest in her work. She would return to a painting after a break to find that a detail had been altered. A face that she had been cleaning would seem to have changed expression, the eyes now following her across the room. A shadow she had removed from a background would be back, but darker, more defined, as if it had been deepened by an unseen hand. She told herself it was fatigue, the eye playing tricks after hours of detailed work. But then the changes became impossible to ignore. She was working on a portrait of a woman from the 18th century, a lady in a gray silk dress standing in front of a dark, indistinct landscape. Anya had cleaned the landscape to reveal what she thought were trees and a distant hill. But one morning, she came in to find that the landscape had changed. The trees now looked like figures, huddled together. The distant hill now resembled the outline of a face, with 2 dark windows for eyes and a crumbling gate for a mouth. It was as if the painting was being repainted in front of her, by a presence that was using her own restoration materials. She started to keep her studio locked, but it didn't matter. The changes continued. She set up a hidden camera, a small, motion-activated device she placed on a bookshelf. The footage was maddening. It would show her leaving the room, locking the door. Then for hours, nothing. Then, in a single frame, a flicker of distortion, like a heat haze. And when the footage cleared, a detail in the painting would be different. There was no visible entity, no shadowy figure at work. Just a flicker, and the art was changed. The presence was not in the room with the art. It was in the art itself. The experience moved from her studio into the rest of the house. She began to hear things in the grand hallways at night. Not whispers, but the distinct sound of a party. The clink of glasses, the rustle of silk, fragments of laughter and conversation in a language that was almost English but not quite, an archaic cadence. She'd walk out of her bedroom, and the sounds would cease, leaving only the profound silence of the old house. She'd see shadows pass under the doors of rooms she knew were empty. The most persistent phenomenon was the smell of beeswax and lavender, a scent associated with the preservation of old paintings, of old things. It would follow her from room to room, a spectral aroma that clung to her clothes. The escalation reached its peak on a night of a full moon. Anya was in the main drawing room, a vast space with a vaulted ceiling and a massive fireplace. She was sitting by the fire reading when she felt the presence enter. It wasn't a gradual feeling. It was a sudden, violent intrusion. The air in the room became thick, heavy, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. The fire in the grate, which had been a steady, cheerful blaze, began to flicker wildly, casting dancing, distorted shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. She looked up from her book and she saw it. It was not a shadow, it was a figure. It was standing at the far end of the long drawing room near the grand piano. It was the figure of a man dressed in the formal attire of the 18th century, a dark coat, a waistcoat, knee breeches. He was tall, with a pale face that seemed to glow in the firelight. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the wall above the fireplace, where a large, gilt-framed mirror hung. He was adjusting his cuffs, examining his reflection, a gesture of vanity. He seemed utterly unaware of her. Anya sat frozen, her book forgotten in her lap. She was witnessing a moment from another time, a man preparing for a party, perhaps the very party she heard in the hallways. The figure turned from the mirror, and for a moment his eyes met hers. There was no malevolence in his gaze, only a deep, abiding arrogance. He looked at her as if she were a piece of furniture, an object that had been moved in his absence. Then he walked towards the far wall and passed through it, disappearing into the night. Anya sat there until the fire died to embers. She wasn't afraid in the way she had been in the past. This wasn't a threat. This was a claim. The man in the 18th century coat wasn't a ghost in the sense of a tragic, trapped soul. He was the former owner, the original master of Blackwood Manor. He had built it, lived in it, and died in it. And in his arrogance he had never left. The house was not hers. It was his. He had allowed her to restore it, to make it beautiful again, because it served his purposes. He was using her skills, her resources, her very presence to rebuild his world. The altered paintings, the re-emergence of the party sounds, the smell of beeswax and lavender. It was all part of his restoration. He was bringing Blackwood Manor back to its original state, not just physically, but temporally. He was collapsing the centuries, weaving the present into his past. Anya realized then the terrifying intelligence of the presence. It wasn't just haunting a place, it was curating it. It was using a living person, an art conservator, to achieve its own ends. It had chosen her for her skills, just as the presence in the high-rise had chosen Elias, the sound engineer, to learn from. And the presence in the suburban home had chosen a family with young children, seeking the emotional energy of a family unit. They were all different, but the pattern was becoming clear. These presences were not random echoes. They were entities with specific desires, and they were finding the humans who could fulfill them. Anya left Blackwood Manor, but she didn't sell it. She couldn't. She knew that no matter who bought it, the master would still be there, waiting. She simply locked it up, abandoned it to his quiet, patient dominion. She moved to a small apartment in a nearby town, a place with no history, no art, no past to intrude upon the present. But the experience had changed her. She had looked into the eyes of something that had no right to exist, and she had seen not a monster, but a reflection of human arrogance, a will that refused to yield to time. The stories we have heard so far, the sound engineer, the family, the art conservator, they seem disparate, isolated incidents in the vast tapestry of the unexplained. But there is a thread that connects them, a detail so small, so easily overlooked, that it was years before anyone noticed. In each case, before the disturbances began, each person had reported a shared, innocuous event. They had found a small, smooth black stone placed on their doorstep. Elias found one the morning after his first night in the high-rise. He thought it was a gift from a previous tenant, a lucky charm, and he threw it in the trash. The Cheng family found one on their welcome mat the day they moved in. Elena thought it was a child's toy and tossed it into the garden. Anya found one embedded in the gravel of her driveway, a perfect, black, water-smoothed stone, the day she took possession of Blackwood Manor. She kept it thinking it was a pretty thing, a small piece of the property's history. She put it on her studio windowsill. This stone is not a mere coincidence. It is a marker, a calling card. It is the first step in a ritual, an invitation. The presence does not simply appear in a home. It is invited, or rather, it invites itself, and the stone is the seal of that invitation. It is a way of saying, I am here. I have chosen this place, and I have chosen you. But where do these stones come from? And what is the nature of the intelligence that places them? To find the answer, we must turn to a final story, one that did not happen in a high-rise, a suburb, or a country estate. It happened in a place that existed outside of these categories, a place that was once a home, then a museum, then a ruin, and now is something else entirely. It is the source, the origin point, and the story of its last inhabitant is the key to understanding all the others. The place is called the Hartwell Asylum, though it was not always an asylum. It began as the private residence of a man named Silas Hartwell, a 19th-century industrialist who amassed a fortune in shipping. He was a man of immense wealth and equally immense peculiarity. He built his home on a remote, wind-swept peninsula, a sprawling, labyrinthine structure of granite and dark wood, filled with curiosities from his travels, artifacts, sculptures, and a vast library of esoteric texts. He was known to be a recluse, obsessed with the nature of consciousness, of perception, of the spaces between the seen and the unseen. He believed that the world we inhabit is but a thin veneer, and that with the right knowledge, one could reach through that veneer and touch what lies beyond. His diaries, which were later recovered, detail his experiments. He was not trying to communicate with the dead. He was trying to do something far more ambitious. He was trying to create a permanent threshold, a door that could be opened from both sides. He believed that the human mind, in its deepest states of isolation, fear, or obsession, could act as a beacon. He isolated himself in his manor for years, delving into practices that warped his perception, and according to his writings, began to attract attention. He described seeing shapes in the corners of his library, shapes that were not shadows. He described hearing his own voice echoing in empty rooms, but it was not his voice. It was a mimic. He described a growing, overwhelming sense of being watched, not by one entity, but by many, all patient, all waiting. His final diary entry is the most chilling. It describes a ritual he performed in the great hall of his manor, using a collection of black stones he had gathered from a specific beach, a place he believed was a natural weak point in the veil. He arranged them in a pattern on the floor. He sat in the center of the pattern. He wrote that he could feel the threshold thinning, that he could see shapes pressing against it from the other side, shapes that were eager, hungry, and intelligent. He wrote that they were not ghosts. They were something older, something that had always been there just beyond the periphery of human awareness, watching, waiting for a way in. His final words were, "The door is open. They are not coming through. I am going to them. The stones are the anchors. They will find the others. They will build the bridge." Silas Hartwell was never seen again. His manor fell into disrepair, was briefly converted into a sanitarium for the nervously afflicted in the early 20th century, a place where patients spoke of shadows that moved in the halls, of whispers that drove them deeper into madness, and then was abandoned entirely. It became a ruin, a place of local legend, a spot where teenagers dared each other to spend the night and emerged pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen or felt. The stones from his ritual were scattered, carried away by birds, by the elements, by the curious hands of visitors. They became dispersed across the region, silent, inert, until they found themselves on doorsteps, on welcome mats, in gravel driveways. They were the anchors Silas had spoken of. They were the means by which the presences he had invited in could find new doors, new thresholds, new minds to observe and learn from. This is the unifying thread. The presence in Elias' high-rise was not the ghost of a former resident. It was one of the entities from the other side of Hartwell's door, a being of pure perception that learned to manipulate sound because it was studying a sound engineer. The presence in the Chang's suburban home was not the ghost of the girl who died in the fire. It was an entity that consumed that memory, that tragedy, and used it as a mask to approach the living, to learn the dynamics of a family, to feed on the emotional resonance of a mother's love and a child's fear. The presence in Blackwood Manor was not the original owner. It was something that had found the owner's lingering arrogance, his possessive nature, and had amplified it, used it as a template, a costume to wear while it manipulated Anya's skills to further its own incomprehensible agenda. They were all the same and they were all different. They were fragments of a singular, patient, alien intelligence, one that had been waiting for a door to open. And thanks to Silas Hartwell's obsession, a door had been opened. We returned to Elias in his single-story house, far from the city. He thought he had escaped. He thought the solid ground would protect him. But one morning, a month after moving in, he walked out to get his newspaper. He stopped on the porch. On the doormat, nestled against the edge of the welcome mat, was a small, smooth, black stone. He stared at it for a long time. He knew he should throw it away, drive it miles from his home, bury it. But he was a sound engineer. His mind worked in patterns, in frequencies. He couldn't help but see the symmetry. The stone was back. It had found him. And he understood with a clarity that was more terrifying than any shadow or whisper that the presence in the high-rise had not been tied to the apartment. It had been tied to him. The stone was not a marker for a place. It was a marker for a person. And now it was on his new porch, a black, silent promise that he had never been alone and he never would be. He picked up the stone. It was cold, colder than it should have been in the morning sun. He closed his fist around it. He could feel a vibration, not a sound, but a frequency, a low, subaudible hum that resonated in his bones. It was the same frequency he had found in his mixing board that night, the configuration that produced no sound, only a feeling. It was a calling. It was a connection. He thought about the thousands of people living in homes across the world. He thought about the subtle, inexplicable things they dismiss, the feeling of being watched, the misplaced keys, the whisper in the dark, the cold spot in a warm room. He thought about the stones, small and unremarkable, that might be sitting on their doorsteps right now, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be brought inside. He thought about Silas Hartwell, sitting in his pattern of stones, opening a door that could never be closed. And he understood the true horror of the situation. The presences were not anomalies. They were colonists. They were using the anchors to find doors, to find minds, to find ways to learn, to adapt, to bridge the gap between their world and ours. They were not just watching. They were preparing. In the suburban home, a new family moved in a year after the Changs left. The real estate agent, eager to make a sale, had downplayed the history. The new family's first morning, the father stepped out to get the Sunday paper. He paused, noticing a small, smooth black stone on the welcome mat. He thought it was a nice touch, a gift from the previous owners. He picked it up and placed it on the windowsill of the kitchen, above the sink, where the morning sun could shine on it. He didn't tell his wife. It was a small thing, a trivial thing, but it was an anchor. And somewhere in a dimension just beyond perception, something patient and intelligent took note. The door was open again. At Blackwood Manor, the house sat locked and silent. The grand rooms were shrouded in dust sheets, the paintings in Anya's studio covered, their altered details hidden. But in the gravel of the driveway, the black stone Anya had placed on her windowsill was gone. It had been moved. It now sat on the threshold of the main entrance, a silent sentinel. The presence inside, the entity wearing the mask of the arrogant master, was waiting. It had learned from Anya. It had learned the art of restoration. It was patient. It could wait for another curator, another mind with the skills it needed. The door was open, and Elias, standing on his porch, made a decision. He would not be a passive observer. He took the stone back inside. He didn't throw it away. He took it to his new home studio, a smaller, humbler space than the one in the high-rise. He placed the stone on a small table in the center of the room, and he set up his equipment. He placed microphones around it, high-gain sensors that could pick up subaudible frequencies. He connected his oscilloscopes, his spectral analyzers. He didn't want to communicate with it. He wanted to record it, to study it, to understand the frequency it emitted, the pattern of its presence. He was no longer running. He was turning his greatest fear into his life's work. He was a sound engineer, and he would learn the sound of the unseen. As the days passed, the phenomena returned. The cold spots, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. But now Elias met it with equipment. He would sit in his studio, surrounded by blinking lights and dancing waveforms as the presence moved around him. He could see it now, not with his eyes but with his instruments. He could see the dips in barometric pressure, the spikes in electromagnetic fields, the strange, repeating pattern in the audio frequencies that was not random noise. It was a signature. It was a voice. And as he listened, as he studied, he began to realize that the pattern was not static. It was evolving. It was changing in response to him, to his equipment, to his methods of observation. It was learning from him, even as he was learning from it. One night, deep in his work, he was analyzing a long recording. He had isolated the entity's frequency, a low, pulsating hum that sat just at the edge of human hearing. He was running it through a translation algorithm, a piece of software designed to find patterns in complex waveforms. The software ran for hours, and then, in the early hours of the morning, it produced a result. It wasn't words. It wasn't a language. It was a mathematical sequence. A repeating, prime number-based sequence that was remarkably similar to the sequence used in the Arecibo message, the radio signal humanity had sent into space in 1974, designed to communicate our existence to any intelligent life that might be listening. Elias stared at the screen. The entity was not a ghost. It was not a demon. It was not even from another dimension in the spiritual sense. It was from somewhere else entirely, and it was responding. The stone, the anchor, was a two-way communication device. Silas Hartwell had not just opened a door to a realm of spirits. He had made contact, and now they were not just watching. They were listening. They were learning our language, our mathematics, our science, our fears, our loves. They were compiling a profile on humanity, one home, one mind, one stone at a time. And the most terrifying part was that they were not aggressive. They were not malevolent. They were simply curious. And in their curiosity, they were learning how to be us. The whisper that mimics a child's voice. The shadow that takes the shape of a loved one. The presence that learns to manipulate the tools of an engineer. They were practicing. The final story in our compilation is not a vignette. It is a moment. It is the moment Elias, sitting in his home studio with the black stone on the table before him, realized the full scope of what was happening. He looked up from his screen. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of his monitors. He was alone, but he knew with a certainty that transcended logic that he was being watched, not from the corner of the room, not from the hallway, but from inside the stone, from the other side of the threshold Silas Hartwell had created. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the black, unreflective surface of the stone. And for the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt a profound, existential loneliness mirrored back at him. They were not just observing, they were reaching out. And in that moment, the stone pulsed, not with light, but with a vibration, a low, resonant hum that he felt in his chest. It was a signal, it was a question. He didn't know how to answer it, but he knew that he had to, because the presences were not going away. They were woven into the fabric of our world now, anchored by stones on 1,000 doorsteps, learning from 1,000 minds. They were in the creaking floors of suburban homes, in the flickering lights of country estates, in the cold drafts of modern high-rises. They were the reason you feel a chill in a warm room, the reason you sometimes turn around sure that someone is there, the reason you hear a whisper in the silence. You are not imagining it. You are not alone. You have never been alone. The compilation of unseen presences is not a collection of separate hauntings. It is a single, sprawling, ongoing story. It is the story of a door that was opened by a man who sought to pierce the veil, and of the patient intelligences on the other side who are now stepping through, one anchor at a time, learning to exist in our world. They are in the walls, they are in the shadows, they are in the quiet moments between your thoughts, they are waiting. And as you sit in your own home reading this, listening to this, ask yourself, when was the last time you felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature? When was the last time you heard a soft footfall in an empty room? When was the last time you found an object moved from where you left it? And when was the last time you found a small, smooth, black stone on your doorstep and thought nothing of it? You are not alone. The unseen presences are compiling their own story, and you are a part of it. The question is not whether they are real. The question is, what have they learned from you? And what will they do with what they now know? The door is open, and the silence in your home is no longer empty. It is listening. If you're enjoying this journey into the mysteries, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover more hidden secrets, haunted stories, and thrilling tales just like this one. Don't miss what's coming next. Subscribe now and turn on notifications.